Hello, welcome to the YouTube channel of Christ United Methodist Church, located in the Owen Brown Interfaith Center here in Columbia, Maryland. My name is Reverend Angela Wells. My pronouns are she and her, and it's my absolute joy to serve as the pastor here at Christ UMC. Whoever you are and whatever your story, we are so grateful that you have found your way here to our YouTube channel today, and we look forward to connecting with you further. Christ UMC is a reconciling congregation, which means that we as a church have committed to the full inclusion of LGBTQ+ persons in the life and ministry of the church. We have also pledged to become an anti-racist church. Both of these commitments are a part of our identity as followers of Jesus Christ, striving to love God and neighbor in all we do. At CUMC, we celebrate Christian love that encompasses absolutely all people.
Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are much more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase and, in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us to oppress and escape from our land." Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses, for the Pharaoh. But the more they oppressed, the more the Israelites multiplied and spread, so the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians subjected the Israelites to forced hard servitude and made their lives bitter with hard servitude in mortar and bricks and every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed upon them. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live." But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are more vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and people multiplied and became very strong.
At first glance, this story may seem like a strange choice for our blessing of the backpack service. Should we even be telling our children such a disturbing story? A story of enslavement, a story of threatened genocide, a story of racial ethnic cleansing. These are very valid questions. But here's the thing, if we only share rated G Bible stories with the kids, if we're honest, we're eliminating the majority of the Bible. The Bible as a whole is not rated G. And right now, in this moment of time in our history as a country, it is extra important to share the whole truth of our history, national and biblical, with our kids and our grown-ups too. If we don't share the whole truth of our history, we are doomed to repeat the same catastrophic mistakes, where if we only share a cleaned up, idealized version of our history, we can expect the same societal sins of racism, white supremacy, homophobia, xenophobia to be replicated. We can only do better when we know better. And we can only know better when we name the ugly parts of history and dare to learn from them. So yes, this story is disturbing. But even more so, this story is disturbingly relevant. In our baptismal vows in the United Methodist Church, we recognize that there are forces of evil, injustice, and oppression in our world. And that followers of Jesus Christ, as followers of Jesus Christ, we commit to resisting these forces. If we send our kids to school telling them that the world is full of rainbows and unicorns, they will not be prepared for the world they actually encounter. Not just the world they encounter as adults, the world they encounter now. A world that doesn't respect the innocence of children, and especially doesn't respect the innocence of Black and brown children. A world in which from pre-K on, they are exposed to lockdown drills, racial slurs, and homophobic discrimination. And we don't even live in Florida. So I'd like to take a look at this story, this disturbing story, but very real story, to explore some lessons, 5 lessons to be precise, for this new school year. Lessons that apply to all of us, students, parents, teachers, grandparents, neighbors, school staff, community members, all of us. So lesson number 1, I've already touched on. Know your history. Our story this morning starts off setting the stage. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Joseph, remember Joseph? A Hebrew son of Jacob, aka Israel, who was sold into slavery in Egypt. But he was a dreamer, right? Remember? A prophet. And he rose through the ranks in Egypt, becoming Pharaoh's right-hand man. It's because of Joseph that Egypt stores up extra grain and survives a famine that Joseph saw coming. Joseph, the Hebrew, saved the Egyptians and the Hebrews. This sets us up for a society of interethnic cooperation and harmony, right? Well, yeah, until there comes a king who does not know Joseph. This new king, this new Pharaoh, has forgotten his own nation's history. He's forgotten that the Hebrew people are neighbors, instead sees them as a threat. Forgetting our history, mistaking neighbors as threats, this leads to oppression every single time. In ancient Egypt, in various waves of immigration in the US, in Nazi Germany, today in places across our country trying to ban books, ban the mention of LGBTQ+ persons, ban the teaching of our history of racialized violence in this country. So lesson number 1, know your history. Lesson number 2 involves a question. Whose voice do we follow? All around us are different voices competing for our attention, for our loyalty, for our dollars, for our choices. Our kids are bombarded by ads as they watch YouTube videos. They are surrounded by different social cliques at school, pushing and pulling them to follow them. And they're surrounded by the same social and political tension that we adults are experiencing in this particular moment in our history. And even if they don't understand all the nuance, they experience that tension itself, and they probably understand more than we give them credit for. While the means of communication might be new, this general situation of having multiple competing voices clamoring for our allegiance is an ancient problem. Imagine the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. They have the king demanding one thing, and their community, their God, demanding the opposite. The king holds all the power here. Insubordination was a huge risk. And yet, how could they live with themselves if they obeyed? How do they decide who to listen to? Sure, the scripture frames it as they choose God. They choose to fear God more than the Pharaoh. Fear, in this case, isn't like frightened. It's more like reverence or respect. When they have a choice of whether to prioritize or listen to Pharaoh or God, they choose God, even when it means lying. The Bible story is really the first account of civil disobedience. The midwives choose life over law, even when it's risky. They choose God over Pharaoh. Oftentimes, the choice isn't obvious. Oftentimes, it's hard for us to discern God's voice in the midst of the chaos of competing messages. When we're faced with an ethical dilemma, how do we figure out which is God's voice? Like the faithful midwives, we choose whatever leads to life, abundant life for everyone. That's our ultimate ethical lens. Which decisions lead to not just survival, but thriving for all of God's beloved? Okay, so lesson number 1, what was it? Know your history. Lesson number 2, listen for God's voice. That brings us to lesson number 3. Resist evil, stand up for the vulnerable. Shipra and Pua find a creative way to save the children, all of the children. Not only do they stage a resistance movement, a planned civil disobedience, they also use Pharaoh's own biases against him. When asked why they aren't obeying Pharaoh's order to kill the baby boys, Shipra and Pua play on Pharaoh's xenophobia. As womanist biblical scholar Wilda Gaffney writes, the midwives use the Pharaoh's cultural bias against him. In Exodus 1:19, they say, the Hebrew women are brutish, animalistic, cheyoth, not refined, like Egyptian women. Their babies just plop out of them. End quote. Pharaoh is afraid of the Hebrew people. He sees them as different, as other, as a threat, as foreign. So the midwives run with that fear, play it up a bit, take advantage of his ignorance. They lie. The midwives get creative in their resistance to evil. They find a way where it feels like there is no way to stand up for the vulnerable, the children. Our call is not that different today. We too are to resist evil, injustice, and oppression, to get creative, to stand up for the vulnerable, the children, the immigrants, the BIPOC people, LGBTQ plus people, the poor, the differently abled, etc. In the schoolyard, who is the kid getting bullied? In the classroom, who is the kid struggling to keep up? The kid who doesn't speak English as their first language. In the lunchroom, who is the kid that doesn't have anyone to sit with them? In the public school board, whose community is underrepresented or inequitably served? We figure out who that kid is, who that person is, who that community is, and that's who we support with our voices, with our actions, with our votes, with our resources. As followers of Jesus Christ, as followers of the God of liberation, we summon the courage of Shipra and Pua to resist evil, injustice, and oppression, and stand up for the marginalized, oppressed, and vulnerable. All right, so lesson number 1, know your history. Lesson number 2, listen for God's voice. Lesson number 3, resist evil, stand up for the vulnerable. Lesson number 4, small actions count. Even when the deck feels stacked against you, even when the injustice feels too big to tackle, even when you're swimming upstream, figure out your small way to help. Figure out your next right thing. You can't do everything, but you can do something. Shipra and Pua had very limited power in this situation. They are women in a patriarchal society. They're part of an enslaved people, the Hebrews in Egypt. Faced with the power of Pharaoh, what power could they possibly have to change the big picture? These two women can't change the fact that their society is patriarchal. They can't change the fact that their people are enslaved. They can't change Pharaoh's ruling of law. But they can refuse to participate in the harm. They can use their skills as midwives and their subversive creativity to find ways to save lives, one baby boy at a time. What skills do we have to use in the movement for justice? As kids, as adults, how can we make a difference one person at a time? All right, number 1, know your history. 2, listen for God's voice. 3, resist evil, stand up for the vulnerable. 4, small actions count. And lastly, you won't have to remember anymore. Number 5, remember who you are and whose you are. The Hebrew midwives had many identities. Their ethnic cultural identity as Hebrews, their gender identity as women, their occupational identity as midwives. It's likely that they were mothers themselves, or aunties or grandmothers. They were friends, they were neighbors. Like all of us, they held many roles and identified themselves in many different ways. But when push came to shove, Shiphrah and Puah understand their ultimate identity as children of God. They know who they are and whose they are. And that gives them the grounding to make hard choices and act with courage and integrity. Students, teachers, parents, school staff, bus drivers, grandparents, neighbors, community members. When push comes to shove, know that you are not your to-do list. You are not your grades. You are not your class's testing score. Your worth is not measured by anyone else's idea of success. Your fundamental worth is grounded in your identity as a child of God. You are a child of God. You belong to God. You are loved. You are enough. So remind yourselves, remind each other. Touch that token on your backpack and remember you are loved by God and by us at Christ UMC. Thanks be to God. Amen.
Thank you so much for tuning in. If you are new to CUMC, whether you are local or tuning in from far away, we would love to connect with you. Please feel free to visit our website at www.cumcobic.org. Visit us on Facebook or connect with me, Reverend Angela, directly at angelawells153@gmail.com. As you move into whatever is next in your day, I invite you to receive this blessing. Beloved, you are made in God's own image. You are enough. You are not alone. Go forth with the blessing of God, the Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer, to share the light and love of Christ in your community and far beyond.